everyone. Here we are to continue talking about Swift and the Swift programming language, and we have been focusing on functions in the last couple videos. And we saw that in Swift, you include the parameters for a function, and they each get a name and a type, width and height, and type is int for both of these. And your function can also have a return value, right? And when you call in the function, you include the name or the label for the values, right? So width here is 25, right? So width in here would be 25, and height is 35, so height is 35 here, and then we would get height of 35, right? So let's talk about another feature in Swift, right? And this is kind of an interesting one that, to me, that I understand is kind of unique to Swift. I haven't seen this in other languages, but Swift parameters can have more than one name, okay? So here's an example here where it says some function, and it says external name, internal name, and then it has a type. So really what we have here is we have two names for the same value. And the idea is that you can see that some function, I'm invoking it down here, and when I invoke it, I use the external name, okay? Internally, the function uses this name as the variable. So inside the function, it's here, right? The internal name is used. And outside the function, when you invoke the function, you're going to use the external name. Okay, and when you write it, you'll say function name, parentheses, external name, space, internal name. Okay, and the external name is optional, so if you leave this off, then it's just all about the internal name as we saw up above here, like radius, for example. Okay. So let's explore that and take a look at it, right? So why would you do that, right? So it seems kind of confusing at first, but if you think about it, actually it's there to make clarity, like when you're writing code, right? Because imagine that when you were calling a function here, you might need to, like, let's say you were calling a function that's going to change the size of a window or draw something on the screen, and you need to give it the original height and width and then a new height and width. So what do you call those parameters, right? So internally, you might want to call them as width 1, height 1, width 2, and height 2. But externally, width 1, height 1, width 2, and height 2 doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So what you could do is you could say, like, why don't we say from width externally, from height externally, to width external, and to height external. So in other words, we're going to go from this width to this width, and from this height to this other height. Internally, we can just use width 1 and height 1 and width 2 and height 2. Okay, so to call on this function, we would define the function in this way with both names. And to call on the function, we would call it this way. So we would say from width, from height, to width, to height. And then internally, we can just use width 1 and width 2, right? And height 1 and height 2. Okay, so again, like the naming is important, right? And by using the names, in this way, when you read this function, it reads a lot better to someone who doesn't know what's going on inside the function, right? And sometimes inside the function, these names, like names that look good outside, don't look as good inside the function. So that's kind of why they give us this option. And again, it's an option, so you don't have to use it. So if one name would fit in both cases, then you can just use that one name. But if you want to have an external name that reads a little bit differently, then you're allowed to do that too. You just include them both when you define the function, okay? So here's a couple more examples, right? So let's imagine like you're creating a function that greets somebody or writes some kind of greeting, right? And it could happen on your social media websites or your shopping portals or something like that, right? And you might have a user and a username and then a with prefix and a prefix, right? So if we call the greet function, we can say greet user with prefix. right? And then that reads pretty good. So you can say greet user Frango with prefix Mr., right? Internally, I don't want to say user here because maybe it's not clear that that's the person's name. And I don't want to say with prefix because that's kind of awkward. So internally inside the function, since I've used both external and internal names, internally I can use the internal names and I can just write it as hello prefix and name. Okay, so that's an example that kind of shows, maybe clarifies like why the naming could be important or where it could make your functions easier to read. And the built like the UI kit code that Apple provides for developing iPhone apps makes a lot of use of this. So you'll see this a lot where the functions read kind of like a sentence with the parameters, right? And it's kind of the style that they use at Apple. So I would get familiar with this and, don't just write it off, like kind of get used to it because you'll see it a lot, okay? So anyway, thanks for watching. There's a couple more challenges here, so you can try these and maybe I'll go over them in the next video, okay?